His hand closed around her throat before she could even turn around. "Shut up, you bitch." The words hit the air like gravel, cold, certain, cruel. 3 men, 1 woman. A deserted road behind the naval compound. No cameras in sight. No witnesses. No backup. They looked at her. The loose dark hair, the olive shirt, the soft curve of her jaw. And they made a decision. They decided she was helpless. That decision would cost them everything. If you're watching this right now, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story has traveled. And stay with me until the very end. Because this one, you won't forget. The road behind the naval compound at night was the kind of quiet that made you feel invisible. No foot traffic, no streetlights, just the distant hum of the ocean, the creak of chain-link fencing, and the long shadows cast by floodlights mounted high on the maintenance building. Emily Carter had walked that road 100 times. She knew every crack in the pavement, every busted light, every blind corner. She was 22 years old, and she had been trained to notice things that other people missed entirely. So when the headlights of a black pickup truck appeared at the far end of the road, moving too slow, angled wrong, engine idling low like something predatory, she noticed. She kept walking, steady pace, hands loose at her sides, breathing even. In her head, she was already running the calculation. 1 vehicle, engine still running, means a driver stayed behind the wheel. Doors opening. Count the sounds. 1, 2, 3. 3 men stepping out. Gap between them, maybe 6 feet. No visible weapons raised. Hands out. Close contact intent. She had 3 seconds before they reached her. She used all 3. Then the first one grabbed her arm. "Hey!" His voice was low, almost friendly, and that made it worse. "Where are you headed?" Emily didn't answer. She looked straight ahead. The second man stepped in front of her, blocking the path. He was big, wide chest, thick neck, the kind of build that came from years of intimidation working so well that he never had to finish a fight. "She asked you a question," he said, even though no one had. Still, Emily said nothing. That silence, she knew, unsettled people. It made them escalate. And when they escalated, they made mistakes. The first man tightened his grip on her arm and shoved her sideways, hard, toward the chain-link fence. Her shoulder hit the metal. She let it. "You think you're tough?" the first man said, stepping close enough that she could smell the beer on his breath. "Little girl playing soldier out here?" The third man laughed, a short, ugly sound that came from the back of his throat. And then the first man did the thing that sealed his fate. He reached up, grabbed her throat, and squeezed. "Shut up," he said. "You bitch." Time did something strange in moments like that. Emily had learned that years ago, during her first week of SEAL candidate training, back when instructors would throw her into stress positions at 2 a.m. and scream into her face until the world narrowed to a single point of white-hot pressure. Time didn't speed up. It stretched. Every second became an inventory. His right hand on her throat. Pressure at 60%, not full grip. He's demonstrating, not eliminating. Left hand free, extended for balance. Weight shifted forward on his front foot. Overconfident, leaning in. The second man, still 3 feet back, turned slightly at the hip, hands up near his chest. Defensive posture. Follower, not initiator. He'll hesitate. The third man, she'd clocked him before the grab, leaning against the fence behind and to her right. He thought he was watching a performance. His arms were crossed. He wasn't ready for anything. None of them were. She breathed. In through the nose, out slow. And she waited. Because one thing every serious operator understood was that action taken one moment too early was just as dangerous as action taken too late. She needed the geometry to be right. She needed all three of them to believe, for just 2 more seconds, that she wasn't going to do anything at all. "You gonna cry?" the man with his hand on her throat taunted. He turned slightly to look back at the third man, grinning. "I think she's gonna cry." The third man uncrossed his arms and took half a step forward. There it was. The geometry was right. What happened next took less than 4 seconds. But in those 4 seconds, the entire architecture of the encounter, everything these 3 men had assumed, every decision they had made, every arrogant calculation they had run, came apart like wet paper. Her right elbow drove into his ribs first. Not a glancing blow, a structural strike, the kind that made the body fold, regardless of size, regardless of strength, because the human ribcage does not negotiate. The man with his hand on her throat made a sound that wasn't a word. His grip broke. She was already moving. A heel kick, rear leg, full rotation from the hip, connected with the second man's knee before he could even raise his hands. The pop was audible. His leg went sideways. He went down. The third man lunged forward. She was expecting it. She caught his wrist with both hands, a single fluid motion, weight dropping under his center of gravity. And then he was in the air. And then he was not. And then he was face down on the pavement, with her knee in his back, and his arm torqued upward at an angle that made further movement a decision he didn't want to make. "Don't," she said. One word. Calm. Quiet. The kind of voice that had never needed to be raised. The third man went completely still. For a moment, nobody moved. The first man was on his knees, one arm across his ribs, making short, staccato breathing sounds. The second was on his side, on the pavement, hand clamped over his knee, not speaking at all. The third was flat on his stomach, nose pressed against the asphalt, one arm useless above him. Emily stood. She reached into the front pocket of her camouflage pants and pulled out a small leather credential wallet. She flipped it open. Naval Special Warfare. Her photo. Her rank. Her unit designation. She held it where all 3 of them could see it. "You picked the wrong road tonight," she said. No anger in her voice. No pride either. Just fact. The first man looked up at her from the ground. Something had shifted in his expression. The sneer was completely gone. In its place was something she recognized. Not quite fear. Something closer to the specific horror of realizing that the story you told yourself about a situation was entirely, catastrophically wrong. "Who are you?" he said. His voice had dropped to almost nothing. She didn't answer that question. She didn't need to. She pulled out her phone, dialed base security, and gave them her grid location. Then she sat on the hood of their truck and waited. When the security vehicle rolled up 3 minutes later, the first thing the duty officer did was look at the 3 men on the ground, then look at Emily, then look back at the 3 men. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "are you injured?" "No," she said. "Did you—" He stopped, looked at her hands, looked at the man still favoring his knee. "Did you do this?" "Yes." He stared at her for another second. "All 3?" "It was efficient," she said. The duty officer's name was Sergeant Daniel Reyes, and in 11 years of military service, he had responded to a lot of calls. He had never responded to a call quite like this one. He walked back to his vehicle and got on the radio. His voice, Emily noted, was very carefully neutral. Base, this is Reyes. I've got 3 males down at grid November 7. Non-life-threatening injuries. Single responding party. I'm going to need a transport unit and... He paused. I think I'm going to need an investigator. One of the fallen men, the first one, the one with the ribs, the one who had put his hand on her throat and called her a bitch, looked up from the ground. She attacked us, he said. His voice had found something like steadiness again. He was reaching for his story. Emily could see it happening in real time, rearranging the facts, looking for the version that made sense. We were just walking and she... There's a camera on that maintenance building, Emily said. She didn't look at him when she said it. She said it to no one in particular, the way you might mention the weather. The man went quiet. Sergeant Reyes looked up at the maintenance building, found the camera mounted near the roofline, looked back at Emily. She was still sitting on the hood of the truck. She hadn't raised her voice once. The camera had captured all of it. The truck blocking the road, the 3 doors opening, the grab, the grip on her throat, the 4 seconds, all of it. And what that footage showed, what it would go on to show every investigator, every officer, every person in the command chain who watched it over the following days, was not a brawl, not a struggle, not a messy, desperate act of self-defense. What it showed was precision. What it showed was someone who had known, from the moment the headlights appeared at the wrong angle on that road, exactly what was going to happen, and had simply waited for the right moment to respond. Sergeant Reyes finished his radio call, walked back over, and stood beside the truck. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he said, quietly, "You're one of the SEAL candidates, aren't you?" Emily looked at him. "Operator," she said, "not candidate." Another silence. Reyes nodded slowly, the way people do when they're processing something that doesn't quite fit the categories they came in with. "Right," he said. He looked at the 3 men on the ground one more time. Then he looked at her. "You know this isn't going to be a simple report." "I know," she said. She didn't seem troubled by that. She seemed, if anything, the same as she had been since he arrived. Steady, unhurried, completely composed. Like someone who had already done the hard part. Like someone who was prepared for whatever came next. And she was. Because Emily Carter had not survived the hardest military selection program in the United States by being rattled by paperwork. What was coming next? The investigations, the interviews, the slow unraveling of something much larger and much darker than one night on a maintenance road. She was ready for all of it. She had been ready for a long time. The report landed on Commander Victor Hale's desk at 0600 the next morning, and he read it 3 times before he picked up the phone. Not because the facts were unclear, because they were too clear. 3 civilian males, 1 active-duty naval special warfare operator, a maintenance road behind the compound, a camera that had caught every second of it. 3 men on the ground, 0 injuries on her side. He set the report down and stared at the wall. In 23 years of military service, Commander Hale had handled assaults, misconduct cases, incidents involving alcohol and bad judgment, and worse, impulse control. He had written reports that made him angry, reports that made him tired, reports that made him wonder, quietly, whether people were fundamentally worth the trouble. But this one made him feel something he didn't have a clean word for. He picked up the phone and called the base investigator. "Tell me you've already seen the footage," he said, without greeting. "Twice," said Captain Lorraine Marsh on the other end. Her voice was flat, deliberate, the voice of someone who had learned long ago that emotion in the early stages of an investigation was a liability. "I'm watching it a 3rd time right now." "And?" A pause. "Sir," she said carefully, "I think we have a problem that goes beyond last night." Emily was in the interview room by 7:30. The room was small, fluorescent lit, with a metal table and 2 chairs, and the particular kind of silence that exists only in spaces where difficult conversations happen regularly. She sat with both hands flat on the table, posture straight, expression neutral. Captain Marsh sat across from her with a legal pad and a pen she hadn't yet uncapped. "I want to start by saying," Marsh began, "that based on preliminary review of the security footage, your actions last night appear to be consistent with lawful self-defense. You're not here because you're in trouble." Emily nodded once.
"I'm here," she said, "because this wasn't the first time."
Marsh looked up from the legal pad. "Excuse me?"
"Those men," Emily said, "or men like them. It wasn't the first incident near this compound. Not by a long way."
The pen was still uncapped. Marsh set it down entirely. "Keep talking," she said. Emily talked for 40 minutes. She talked about the incident 3 months ago. A female logistics specialist who had been followed from the commissary parking lot to her barracks door by 2 men in civilian clothes. The specialist had reported it. The report had been filed. Nothing had followed. She talked about the incident 6 weeks before that. A group of men shouting from a vehicle at a female officer walking to the PT facility at 05:30. The officer had documented it. The documentation had gone into a folder. The folder had gone somewhere undefined.
She talked about the pattern, the way these things accumulated in whisper networks between female personnel on the base. The informal warnings passed between women about which roads to avoid, which hours were safer, which areas near the fence line had lighting problems that the maintenance requests somehow never managed to fix. And then she set a folded piece of paper on the table. Marsh looked at it without touching it. "What is that?" she asked. 6 names, Emily said. 6 women who experienced similar incidents in the past 8 months. 3 of them filed formal reports. The reports exist in the system. You can verify them. Marsh stared at the paper. "You came prepared," she said. "I've been prepared for a while," Emily said. "I just needed a reason for someone to actually listen." That sentence landed in the room and stayed there. Marsh uncapped her pen. She picked up the folded paper with 2 fingers, carefully, the way you handled something that had weight beyond its physical dimensions. "Petty Officer Carter," she said, "how long have you been tracking this?" "Since December," Emily said. 4 months. "Alone?" "Not entirely." A pause. "But mostly." Marsh wrote something on the legal pad. Then she looked up. "Why didn't you bring this forward before last night?" Emily looked at her directly, not with hostility, with the specific, measured patience of someone who had given this question serious thought. "Because before last night," she said, "there was no footage." The footage changed everything. That was the blunt reality that Commander Hale and Captain Marsh spent the rest of that morning navigating with increasing urgency. Without the camera, last night was one woman's account of an ambiguous incident on a dark road. With the camera, it was evidence, clean, time-stamped, irrefutable, of a coordinated approach, a physical assault, and a pattern of behavior that had been quietly metastasizing around the base for the better part of a year. The 3 men were identified by 0900. 2 were contract maintenance workers with base access badges. The 3rd was the younger brother of one of them. No base affiliation, no clearance, which raised an entirely separate and deeply uncomfortable question about how he had accessed a secured area of the compound at night. Hale read those findings standing up. He didn't sit back down for a long time. "Pull their access logs," he told Marsh. "Everything. I want to know every time those badges were scanned, every area they accessed, every night they were here past standard hours." "Already requested," she said. He looked at her. "How far back?" "I asked for 12 months." He nodded. Then, quieter. How bad is this going to be? Marsh didn't answer immediately. She looked at the footage, still paused on her laptop screen. The frame frozen on the moment Emily's hand closed around the third man's wrist, the half-second before the throw. "I think," she said carefully, "that we're going to find this is significantly worse than last night." By 1100, the access logs had come back. The two contract workers had been on base, after standard hours, on 14 separate occasions over the past 5 months. Their badge access showed them in areas they had no work justification to be in. Residential corridors near female barracks, the path between the commissary and the PT facility, the maintenance road. 14 times. Marsh printed the log, highlighted the dates, and carried it down the hall to Hale's office. She knocked twice and pushed the door open without waiting for an answer. That alone told him something. He looked at the highlighted dates and said nothing for a long moment. "Cross-reference those dates," he said finally, "against any incident reports filed by female personnel, any category. Harassment, threatening behavior, suspicious persons, anything." She had already done it. She put a second sheet on his desk. 6 of the 14 dates matched reported incidents. 3 of those incidents had been formally filed. 3 had been logged informally, noted by an officer, summarized, and not escalated. Hale picked up the sheet and held it and felt something shifting in his chest that he recognized as the specific weight of institutional failure. Not someone else's failure. His base. His command structure. His responsibility. "Who didn't escalate the informal reports?" he asked. Marsh was quiet for just a beat too long. "That's what I need to look into next," she said. Emily was still in the interview room when Marsh came back. She had been given water and told she could leave, that her initial statement was sufficient for now, that she was free to return to her unit, and they would be in contact. She had thanked the administrative officer who delivered that message, waited for him to leave, and then stayed exactly where she was. When Marsh walked back in, she looked at Emily with an expression that had changed since the morning. Something had opened in it. Something harder. "You're still here," Marsh said. "I figured you'd be back," Emily said. Marsh sat down. She didn't have the legal pad this time. She folded her hands on the table and looked at Emily the way you looked at someone when you were deciding how honest to be. "The access logs came back," she said. Emily didn't change expression, but something behind her eyes sharpened. 14 times, Marsh said. Over 5 months. A silence. "And the incident reports?" Emily said. 6 matches. 3 filed, 3 not escalated. Emily absorbed that. Her jaw moved slightly, a microtension, the only visible sign of what she was feeling. "Who didn't escalate them?" she asked, and Marsh said the name. Emily had not expected the name. She had built a careful mental architecture around this investigation. What she knew, what she suspected, what she was prepared to find. She had been methodical. She had been thorough. She had spent 4 months of her own time, in the margins of one of the most demanding jobs in the United States military, constructing a picture from fragments and whispers and the quiet, credible fear of women who had learned that the system sometimes looked the other way. But she had not expected that name. She looked at the table. Marsh didn't fill the silence. She let it exist, because she understood that what had just happened in this room required space. After a long moment, Emily looked up. "How long have you known?" she asked. 20 minutes, Marsh said. "And the commander?" "He knows." Emily nodded, slowly, processing. "Okay," she said. That was all she said, but the way she said it, quiet, resolute,
carrying the full weight of what came next, said everything else. This had stopped being about last night a long time ago. And whoever had chosen to look away when those 3 informal reports landed on their desk, whoever had made the calculation that it wasn't worth the trouble, that the women who filed them probably exaggerated, that it was easier to let it go than to push it up the chain, that person was about to find out what happened when the wrong thing got ignored for too long. The name was Lieutenant Commander Aaron Briggs. Marsh said it once, quietly, and let it sit there between them like something that couldn't be taken back. Emily knew that name. Everyone on the base knew that name. Aaron Briggs was 12 years in, decorated twice. The kind of officer who gave speeches at induction ceremonies about integrity and unit cohesion and the sacred responsibility of leadership. He had a photo on the base website. He coached the junior enlisted volleyball team on Wednesday afternoons. He was also, according to the 3 incident reports that had quietly died on his desk, the last person to touch the paperwork, and the first person to decide it wasn't worth moving forward. Emily sat very still. "He signed off on the informal disposition?" she asked. "On 2 of the 3, Marsh said. The third one technically never made it past his administrative assistant, but the routing log shows it passed through his office." "So he saw it?" "He saw it." Emily's hands were flat on the table. She pressed them down slightly, a small, controlled motion, the physical equivalent of keeping your voice level when everything inside you wants to do something else entirely.
"What happens now?" she said.
Marsh looked at her steadily. "That depends on how far up this goes." By 1300, Commander Hale had called a closed meeting. No assistants, no administrative staff. Just Hale, Marsh, the base JAG officer, and a representative from Naval Criminal Investigative Service who had driven over from the regional office and arrived looking like someone who had already read everything and was quietly furious about it. The NCIS agent's name was Special Agent Diana Reyes, no relation to Sergeant Reyes from the night before, a coincidence that nobody mentioned. She was in her mid-40s, with short gray-streaked hair and the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades in rooms where people lied to her and had long since stopped being surprised by it. She set her bag down, took the chair across from Hale, and said, without preamble, "Tell me about Briggs." Hale folded his hands. "Aaron Briggs has been with this command for 4 years.
Prior to that, Naval Station Norfolk, 2 years. Prior to that, Coronado.
Any prior complaints?"
Nothing formal. Reyes wrote something.
Informal?
A pause.
"There were conversations," Hale said carefully. Reyes looked up from her notepad. "Commander," she said, and her voice didn't rise, but something in it sharpened considerably. "I need you to understand that 'there were conversations' is exactly the kind of answer that turns a misconduct investigation into a command accountability investigation. So I'm going to ask you again. Informal complaints against Briggs. What, when, and who handled them?" The room was very quiet. Hale looked at the JAG officer, then back at Reyes. And then he told her about the conversations. There had been 2, 18 months ago and 8 months ago. Both informal, female personnel who would raise concerns through back channels rather than formal filing, the way women in institutional environments learn to do when they weren't sure they'd be believed. Both concerns had been noted and discussed, and ultimately absorbed into the management structure without generating any documented action. Both had been handled by Briggs himself. When Reyes heard that last part, she stopped writing. "He handled the complaints about his own conduct?" she said. "The complaints weren't explicitly about him at the time," Hale said. His voice had the careful, measured quality of a man who was beginning to understand the full shape of what he was sitting inside. They were about the pattern near the compound. He was the routing officer for that category of report. And no one thought to note that as a conflict of interest? It wasn't a question. Reyes had moved past questions into a different register entirely. "No," Hale said. No one did. Emily found out about the NCIS involvement at 14:30, when Sergeant Reyes, the other Reyes, the one who had been first on scene the night before, appeared at the door of the interview room, where she was still, improbably, sitting. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. "You're still here," he said. That was the second time someone had said that to her today. "Seems like the right place to be," she said. He came in and closed the door. He wasn't in an official capacity. She could tell by the way he held himself, slightly off-duty, the posture of a man who was acting on something personal rather than procedural. "NCIS is here," he said. "I figured they would be." He sat down in the other chair. He was quiet for a moment, in the way people are quiet when they're deciding whether to say the thing they actually came to say. "Carter," he said, "how long have you been carrying this?" She looked at him. 4 months, she said. "Give or take." "Alone?" She almost smiled. That was the same word Marsh had used. Alone. Everyone kept landing on that word, as if the most remarkable thing about the last 4 months was that she had done it without help. As if that were the surprising part. "There were women who helped me," she said. "They just couldn't afford to be visible about it." Reyes was quiet for another moment. "The name they found," he said carefully. "Briggs. Did you know before this morning?" Emily looked at the table, then back at him. "I suspected," she said. "I didn't know." "But you had him in your head as a possibility." "I had several people in my head as possibilities," she said. "That's different from having evidence." Reyes nodded slowly. He understood the distinction. In 11 years of military law enforcement, he had learned hard lessons about the difference between a theory and a fact, and about what happened when people confused the two. "You played this right," he said quietly. "I played it the only way that would work," she said. At 1600, Special Agent Reyes requested an interview with Lieutenant Commander Briggs. He arrived 12 minutes later, in full uniform, expression neutral, the practiced composure of a man who had been managing other people's perceptions of him for his entire career. He walked into the interview room, saw Reyes at the table, and sat down with the easy confidence of someone who had no idea yet how much had already unraveled. "Agent Reyes," he said pleasantly, "what can I do for you?" She slid a single sheet across the table. The access log. 14 dates, highlighted. He looked at it. His expression didn't change immediately, but something microscopic shifted around his eyes. "I'm showing you the access records for 2 individuals with base contractor badges," Reyes said. "I'd like to walk through these dates with you and discuss any correlating incident reports that crossed your desk." Briggs looked at the sheet for another moment. "Of course," he said. "Happy to help." That was his first mistake, the word happy. In 15 years of interviewing people, Reyes had learned that people who were genuinely innocent said things like, "absolutely," or "sure," or "of course." People who were performing innocence said, "happy." She uncapped her pen and began. The interview lasted 40 minutes. Briggs was good. She had to give him that. He answered every question with the smooth efficiency of someone who had spent years in briefing rooms, who knew how to give complete-sounding answers that contained almost nothing. He acknowledged the reports. He explained his disposition decisions with careful, plausible-sounding rationale. He was consistent. He was articulate. And he looked her in the eye throughout. But at the 22-minute mark, she showed him the routing log for the 3rd report, the one that had technically never been formally filed. the one that had passed through his office before disappearing, and Briggs said he had never seen it. Reyes wrote that down, slowly, deliberately, because the routing log showed his assistant had flagged it as red. And the assistant, she already knew, because she had spoken to the assistant an hour ago, had placed it physically in his inbox and watched him pick it up. He had held it in his hands, and now he was telling her he'd never seen it. She let the silence run for 5 full seconds. "Lieutenant Commander," she said, "I want to give you an opportunity to reconsider that answer." Something moved behind his eyes, a flicker, fast and controlled, but real. "I see a lot of paperwork," he said. "I'm sure you do," Reyes said. This one had a woman's name on it, and a description of 2 men following her for 4 blocks inside a secured area. I'd think that would be memorable. Briggs was quiet. "I may have reviewed it and determined it didn't meet the threshold for escalation," he said. "That's a different answer than, 'I never saw it.'" The temperature in the room had changed. Briggs felt it. His jaw tightened, a small movement, almost nothing. But Reyes catalogued it the way she catalogued everything. "I misspoke," he said. "You misspoke," she repeated. She wrote it down, set the pen beside the notepad, looked at him with the calm, unhurried attention of someone who had exactly what she needed and was in no particular hurry to use it yet. "Lieutenant Commander Briggs," she said, "I'm going to ask you to remain available for the rest of the day. We're going to need to continue this conversation." He stood up. His posture was still perfect. His expression was still controlled. But the easy confidence he had walked in with was not the same thing he was walking out with, and both of them knew it. He left without another word. Reyes sat alone at the table for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and sent a 2-word text to her supervisor back at the regional office. It said, "We're filing." Emily heard the news from Marsh at 17:15. Not the details. The investigation was active. The details were protected. But Marsh came back to the interview room one final time, sat down across from her, and said simply, "It's moving forward, formally, all the way up." Emily absorbed that. "All 3 reports?" she said. "All 3 reports, plus the access logs, plus last night." "And Briggs?" Marsh looked at her carefully. "He's been removed from his routing duties pending investigation." A silence. Emily looked at the table. Her expression was controlled, but something behind it had shifted. A long, slow exhale of something she had been holding for 4 months. Not relief exactly, more like the feeling of setting down something heavy that you had carried so far and for so long that you had almost forgotten what it felt like to stand without the weight of it. "The other women," she said. "The 6 names I gave you." "We'll be contacting each of them," Marsh said, with discretion. Emily nodded. Then she stood up, straightened her shirt, picked up her cap from the table, where it had been sitting since 07:30 that morning. "Am I free to go?" she said. "You've been free to go since 0800, Marsh said. Her voice was dry, but not unkind. Emily moved toward the door. Then she stopped. She didn't turn around. "Captain Marsh," she said. "Yeah?" "Thank you for listening." Marsh looked at the table, at the folded piece of paper with 6 names still sitting where Emily had placed it that morning, at the pen she had uncapped at the beginning of all this, which had now filled 7 pages of a legal pad. "Thank you for having the evidence," she said quietly. Emily walked out. The hallway was empty. Her footsteps were steady, unhurried, the same pace she had kept on that maintenance road the night before, when headlights had appeared at the wrong angle and 3 men had climbed out of a truck and made the last bad decision of their comfortable lives. She had known, even then, that the fight was never really about the road. It had always been about this, and it was far from over. The 6 women didn't know each other. That was the first thing Marsh noticed when she began making contact. Carefully, individually, through channels that bypassed the standard reporting structure entirely. 6 women stationed at the same base, moving through the same corridors, eating in the same mess hall, and not one of them had known that 5 others had experienced something similar. Not one of them had known she wasn't alone.
That isolation, Marsh was beginning to understand, had not been accidental. The first woman she spoke to was Petty Officer Second Class Renata Okafor. 26 years old, supply logistics, 8 months from the end of her first enlistment. She sat across from Marsh in a small conference room and listened to the reason for the meeting with an expression that moved through several stages: wariness, then recognition, then something that was almost grief. "You found the report," Renata said. "We found the report," Marsh confirmed. Renata looked down at her hands. "I filed that 7 months ago. After that, nothing. I asked twice what happened to it. Both times I was told it was under review." She paused. "I stopped asking after that." "Why?" Renata looked up. Her eyes were steady, but the steadiness had cost her something. "Because the second time I asked," she said, "the person I asked suggested that I might be misremembering the incident. That stress could affect perception. That maybe what I thought happened and what actually happened were 2 different things." Marsh wrote it down. She kept her expression neutral because what she was feeling was not neutral at all. "Who said that to you?" she asked. Renata told her. It was Briggs. By the time Marsh had spoken to all 6 women, she had filled another legal pad. The details varied, different locations, different times, different specifics. But the through line was identical. Every single one of them had reported something. Every single one of them had encountered, at some point in the process, either a dead end or an active discouragement. And in 4 of the 6 cases, Briggs was present at the point of discouragement. Not always directly. Sometimes it was a comment relayed through a supervisor. Sometimes it was a suddenly unavailable appointment, a report that lost its urgency, a sense, communicated through bureaucratic inertia rather than explicit words, that pursuing this particular thing was going to be harder than it was worth. 4 months ago, Emily Carter had started collecting fragments of these stories and building them into a pattern. Now Marsh held the pattern in her hands, and it was worse than she had let herself anticipate that morning. She called Reyes. "I have 4 direct connections," she said. "Briggs to the incidents. 4 of the 6 women encountered him at the point where their reports stopped moving." A pause on the other end of the line. "That's not negligence," Reyes said. "No," Marsh said. "It's not." At 0900 the next morning, Special Agent Reyes walked back into the base. She didn't go to the interview room this time. She went directly to Commander Hale's office, closed the door behind her, and put a 12-page preliminary report on his desk. He read the first 3 pages standing up. Then he sat down and read the rest without moving. When he finished, he set the report down and looked at the wall for a long moment. "He knew the contractor workers," Reyes said. "We pulled his personal phone records this morning under the warrant. One of the 2 contract workers, the one whose brother had unauthorized access to the compound, is listed in his contacts. 14 text messages over the past 4 months." Hale turned to look at her. "What kind of texts?" he asked. His voice was very quiet. "Short ones," Reyes said. "Nothing explicit. Area clear. Quiet tonight. Shift change 0200. She paused. "They're the kind of texts that don't mean anything by themselves. In context, they mean everything." The silence in the room was enormous. "He was feeding them information," Hale said. Not a question. The full, terrible geometry of it was assembling itself in his mind in real time. "We believe so," Reyes said. "We believe he was telling them when female personnel would be in isolated areas, when patrols were light, when the maintenance road would have minimal traffic. Hale stood up. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to the room. "Aaron Briggs," he said. Just the name. Like he was trying to reconcile something that refused to be reconciled. "He's been in your command for 4 years," Reyes said. She said it without cruelty, but she said it clearly. Because clarity, at this stage, was the only form of respect that mattered. Hale turned around. "I want him in custody before noon," he said. The arrest happened at 10:47. Briggs was in a staff meeting when 2 NCIS agents appeared at the conference room door. He saw them, and something in his face performed a rapid, involuntary sequence. Surprise, confusion, and then, for just a fraction of a second, something that looked almost like relief. As if a weight he had been carrying had finally, after a long time, found a place to land. Then the performance snapped back into place. "This is a mistake," he said, standing. He said it to the agents, then to the room, then to no one in particular. "Whatever you think you have, it's not what it looks like." The agents didn't respond to that. They had heard every version of that sentence. He was escorted out of the building in full view of the people who had worked beside him for 4 years. Some of them looked away. Some of them watched. One junior officer, a young woman who had been in her 2nd month at the base when she had reported a suspicious incident that never went anywhere, watched from the window as the vehicle pulled away. She didn't say anything. She went back to her desk and sat down, and sat very still for a long time. Emily found out the way everyone else on the base did, through the network of whispers that moved faster than official communication always had and always would. She was in the PT facility when a fellow operator named Marcus Webb jogged up beside her and said, without breaking stride, "They took Briggs." Emily kept her pace steady. "When?" she said. 20 minutes ago. NCIS." She ran another 400 meters without speaking. "You knew," Webb said. It wasn't an accusation. He had worked with her long enough to recognize the difference between surprise and confirmation. "I suspected," she said. Same answer she'd given Reyes. Same answer, because it was still true. "How long?" "Long enough." Webb was quiet for a moment. He was 31, 6 years in, the kind of man who expressed respect through directness rather than compliment. "You could have burned this whole thing down faster if you'd gone loud about it," he said. "Gone to the press, made noise." "And what would have happened to those 6 women?" Emily said. "Their names in a news cycle? Their careers? Their units treating them like problems instead of people?" Webb had no answer for that. "I needed it clean," Emily said. "Documented, irrefutable. The kind of case that doesn't get dismissed on a technicality and doesn't blow back on anyone who wasn't asking for it." She slowed to a stop, turned and looked at him directly. "The point was never to make noise, Marcus. The point was to make it stick." At 1400, Commander Hale made an announcement to the base. He didn't use euphemisms. He didn't say, "ongoing personnel matter," or "administrative action." He stood in front of the assembled unit and said that an NCIS investigation had been initiated into serious misconduct, that additional measures were being implemented immediately to address gaps in the reporting and escalation process for harassment incidents, and that anyone with information relevant to the investigation should come forward. Then he said something that was not in any official script. He said, "This command failed some of you. I failed some of you. That is not a statement I make lightly, and it is not one I intend to make twice." The room was very still. In the back row, a female logistics specialist named Renata Okafor sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes straight forward. She didn't cry. She was past crying about this particular thing, but something in her posture changed. A minute shift,
barely visible, the physical language of a person who has been carrying something alone for a very long time, and has just been told, for the first time by someone with actual authority, that they were right to feel its weight. At 16:30, Marsh found Emily one more time. Emily was alone, sitting outside the administrative building. She had a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, and was looking at nothing in particular with the far-focused gaze of someone processing more than the immediate view. Marsh sat down beside her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "Okafor talked to me this morning," Marsh said finally. "And the others. All of them." Emily nodded. She had already heard. "Briggs told Renata that she might be misremembering," Marsh said. 7 months ago. He used the word stress. Said it could distort perception." Emily's jaw tightened, just slightly. "She believed him for a while," Marsh said.
She started second-guessing herself, wondered if maybe she had overreacted, spent months carrying that. Emily looked down at the cold coffee in her hands. "That's the part that isn't in any of the reports," she said quietly. "What it does to someone. Not the incident, the afterward. The part where you start wondering if you're the problem." She said it with the weight of someone who had personal knowledge of the territory. Marsh looked at her. "Did he ever try that with you?" she asked carefully. Emily was quiet for a moment. "He tried it once," she said. "Early on, when I first started asking questions." She paused. "I don't second-guess easily." "No," Marsh said. "I don't imagine you do." Another silence. A long one. "What happens to him now?" Emily asked. "That goes to JAG, then to the convening authority. Given the phone records, the direct communication with the contractor, we're looking at charges well beyond administrative misconduct." Emily absorbed that. "And the contractor workers?" "Federal charges. Unauthorized access to a secured facility, aggravated assault. The brothers looking at additional counts." Marsh paused. "All 3 of them from the road." Emily set the cold coffee down on the ground beside her boot. "Good," she said. Just that word. Clean and final, the way she said most things, without flourish, without performance, without needing the moment to be larger than it already was. But the word carried everything. The 4 months, the fragments and whispers, the 6 names on a folded piece of paper, the women who had filed reports that disappeared, the women who had stopped asking, the cold road at night, and a hand on her throat, and a voice that had called her something she was never going to be. All of it was in that one word. And sitting there in the late afternoon, with the weight of the past 24 hours pressing quietly against everything, Emily Carter understood that the fight she had finished on that maintenance road had only ever been the beginning of a much longer one. But this part, this piece of it, was done, and it had stuck. 3 weeks passed. The base didn't go back to normal, because normal, it turned out, had never been as stable as people had assumed. What happened instead was something slower and more honest than normal. Something that required people to look at things they had been comfortable not looking at, and decide what kind of institution they actually wanted to be. The JAG proceedings against Briggs moved quickly, because the evidence was the kind that didn't leave much room for argument. The phone records, the routing logs, the testimony of 4 women who described the same pattern of discouragement delivered by the same man in the same careful, plausible-sounding voice. The access logs showing 14 unauthorized after-hours visits by contractor workers who had his number saved in their phones. His attorney argued that the text messages were ambiguous, that area clear could mean any number of things, that his disposition of the reports had been a judgment call within his administrative authority. The judge advocate looked at the full picture, all of it assembled together the way Emily had always known it needed to be, and was not persuaded.
Briggs was formally charged on 4 counts, including dereliction of duty and conduct unbecoming an officer. The contractor workers faced federal prosecution separately. The brother, the one who'd had no business being anywhere near the compound that night, was looking at the longest exposure of the 3. All of it was moving. All of it was documented. All of it was, finally, real. Renata Okafor re-enlisted. She hadn't planned to. 8 months out from the end of her first enlistment, she had been quietly preparing to leave. Not because she wanted to, but because staying in a place that had told her she was misremembering her own experience had started to feel like a choice she couldn't justify to herself anymore. She came to tell Marsh about the re-enlistment in person. She didn't have to. Marsh wasn't her commanding officer, wasn't her chain of command, wasn't anyone she was obligated to report good news to. But she came anyway, stood in the doorway of Marsh's office, and said simply, "I'm staying in." Marsh looked up from her desk. "Yeah?" she said. "Yeah." Renata's voice was steady. "Somebody has to." Marsh looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded, the way you nodded at something that deserved more than words. "Good," she said. Renata turned to leave. Then she stopped. "The woman who started this," she said, "Carter, does she know about me staying?" "I can tell her," Marsh said. Renata thought about it for a second. "Tell her it mattered," she said. "What she did. Tell her it mattered to a real person." Marsh told her. Emily was in a briefing room when the message came through. A short text, 6 words. Okafor, re-enlisted. She said it mattered. Emily read it once, set her phone face down on the table. And for approximately 4 seconds, in a room full of operators who were deep in a tactical discussion and paying no attention to her, she closed her eyes. Nobody saw it. Nobody was meant to. But in those 4 seconds, something that had been locked tight in her chest for 4 months, through the documentation and the whisper networks and the careful, patient construction of an irrefutable case, released slightly. Not all the way, not with fanfare, just enough to breathe. Then she opened her eyes, picked up her pen, and returned to the briefing. The base security review was completed and published internally 2 weeks after the arrest. It was 31 pages long. It identified 7 specific failures in the incident reporting and escalation process. Gaps that had existed not because of a single bad actor, but because the system had been designed in a way that concentrated too much discretionary authority in too few hands, without adequate oversight. Briggs had exploited that design, but the design itself had made it exploitable. The review recommended structural changes. Mandatory third-party review of any harassment report that didn't advance within 30 days. An anonymous reporting channel outside the standard chain of command. Regular audits of contractor access logs. Commander Hale signed off on every recommendation. Then he did something that wasn't in the review document. He called a second all-hands. Smaller than the first, just the officers, and said what he needed to say in the way that hard things needed to be said, which was directly and without the comfort of procedural language. "Some of us knew something was off," he said. "Some of us heard things in the margins and decided it wasn't our problem. Some of us trusted a man we shouldn't have trusted because he was good at his job in the ways we knew how to measure." He paused. "That stops now. Not because NCIS is watching, because it was always wrong." The room was silent, in the way that rooms were silent when people were genuinely absorbing something, rather than simply waiting for it to be over. In the third row, a senior chief petty officer, who had worked alongside Briggs for 2 years,
and had found his dismissiveness toward female personnel vaguely uncomfortable, but never worth raising, sat with his hands folded and his eyes on the floor, and felt the specific, humbling weight of a person being told, accurately, that their silence had a cost. He didn't argue with it. He sat with it instead. That, Hale had learned, was what accountability actually looked like in practice. Not dramatic confession, not performance, just the quiet, private reckoning of a person deciding to do better from a particular moment forward. Marcus Webb found Emily on the track 2 weeks after the arrest. Not to run. He just walked up and fell into step beside her and said, "The new reporting protocol goes live Monday." "I heard," she said. "Anonymous channel, external review, the whole thing." "I heard that too." He was quiet for a moment. "You know what's going to happen now," he said.
"You know what this does to how people see you."
Emily glanced at him.
"People were always going to see me some way," she said. "That was never the variable I was trying to control."
Webb thought about that. "Some of the guys are weird about it," he said. Honest, because that was how he communicated. Not bad weird, just recalibrating. Some of them had no idea any of this was happening. They feel like they missed something obvious.
"They did miss something obvious," Emily said, without accusation, just fact.
"Yeah," he paused. "They know that now." She slowed her pace slightly.
"That's the point," she said. "Not punishment, not making people feel guilty, just, now you know. Now you see it differently. Now maybe the next woman who files a report doesn't spend 7 months wondering if she imagined the whole thing."
Webb was quiet for a long stretch of track. "You know what the wild part is?" he said finally.
"What?"
"You almost didn't fight back that night. On the road."
"I mean, you had every legal justification to go harder. You could have put all 3 of them in the hospital."
Emily shook her head.
"If I'd gone harder," she said, "the story would have been about that. It would have been about the female operator who lost her temper on a maintenance road. It would have been about proportionality and use of force, and whether she was unstable." She paused. "I needed the story to be about them, what they did, what was behind what they did, not about me."
Webb stared at her. "You calculated all of that in 4 seconds, he said.
"I calculated some of it," she said. "The rest I'd already calculated over 4 months."
He let out a short breath, not quite a laugh, something more involuntary than that. "Carter," he said, "you might be the most dangerous person on this base." She kept walking.
"I know," she said simply.
The hearing concluded on a Thursday. Briggs entered a plea that his attorney had negotiated over 10 days of back and forth with the JAG office. It was not the full accounting that the charges had originally outlined. Plea arrangements rarely were. But it carried a mandatory separation from service, forfeiture of benefits, and a formal finding of misconduct that would follow him permanently. Emily was not in the courtroom. She hadn't asked to be. She had given her formal statement weeks earlier, had answered every question put to her, had provided every piece of documentation she carried. That was her part. The courtroom wasn't where her work happened. She found out the outcome the same way she had found out about the arrest. Through the network. Through a brief message. Through the steady accumulation of information that moved through a military community, whether or not official channels were moving at speed. She was in the equipment bay when she got the word. She read it, set her phone in her pocket, picked up the gear she had come there to collect, and she went back to work. 2 days later, a group of junior recruits passed her on the compound path. They were new, visibly, obviously new. The specific combination of alertness and uncertainty that marked the first weeks of base life. A few of them glanced at her as she walked past. One of them, a young woman with a short-cropped fade and the bearing of someone who had worked very hard to get to exactly this place, looked at Emily with the careful attention of someone trying to read a person accurately. Emily noticed. She noticed everything. She didn't stop walking, didn't acknowledge the look, didn't perform anything for the audience of new eyes. But as she passed, the young recruit turned to the colleague beside her and said, in a low voice that she didn't know Emily could still hear, "Is that Carter?" The colleague glanced over. "Yeah," he said. "The one from the road?" "The one from the road." The young woman watched Emily's back as she walked away. The steady pace, the straight posture, the complete absence of any need to be noticed. Processing what she was seeing against what she had heard, building her own understanding of it. "She doesn't look like what I expected," the young woman said. Her colleague looked at her. "That's kind of the whole point," he said. That night, Emily sat outside alone. The base was quiet. The ocean was doing what oceans did. Constant, indifferent, larger than any specific thing happening on the land beside it. She had a cup of coffee that she was actually drinking this time, and she was looking at nothing in particular, with the open, resting focus of someone who had earned the right to simply exist without a task for a few minutes. She thought about Renata Okafor deciding to stay. She thought about the young recruit on the path, recalibrating her expectations in real time. She thought about 6 names on a folded piece of paper, and the women those names belonged to, and the particular kind of courage it took to file a report when you weren't sure anyone was going to believe you, and to file it anyway, because the alternative was silence, and silence had its own cost. She thought about the maintenance road, the headlights at the wrong angle, the 3 doors opening. She thought about a hand on her throat and a voice that had called her something she was never going to be. And she thought about the 4 seconds, the geometry clicking into place, the decision made, the action taken without hesitation or rage or the need for it to mean anything beyond the immediate and necessary fact of it. She had not fought back that night because she was angry. She had fought back because she was trained and prepared, and because some things, some people, were worth protecting, even when protecting them required you to be the only one willing to step into the space where the protection needed to happen. That was what the uniform meant to her. Not rank, not recognition, not the right to walk past other people with the confidence of someone who had made it through a hard selection program. It meant being the kind of person who showed up, who documented things carefully and carried them patiently, and waited for the moment when the evidence was clean enough to be irrefutable, who understood that the loudest version of justice was rarely the most durable one. She finished the coffee, stood up, looked out at the dark water for one more moment. Then she went inside. Behind her, the base held its quiet, the maintenance lights on their high poles, the chain-link fencing running its long perimeter, the road where 3 men had made the last arrogant calculation of their comfortable lives. The road looked ordinary now, but the women who walked it differently. And that was the thing about real change. It didn't announce itself. It didn't come with ceremony or noise or a moment you could point to and say, "There, that's when everything shifted." It came in the form of a junior recruit recalibrating her expectations on a compound path, a woman deciding to re-enlist, a commander standing in front of his officers and using the word wrong without flinching. It came in the form of 6 reports that finally, after everything, meant something. Emily Carter had walked onto a dark road on an ordinary night, and 3 men had grabbed her because they looked at her and saw something easy. What they had actually grabbed was the one person on that base who had already spent 4 months preparing for exactly this moment. who had the evidence, the training, the patience, and the absolute refusal to be anything less than what she was. They had reached for a victim. They had found a reckoning. And the quiet woman with the dark hair and the olive shirt walked back to her barracks and slept soundly. Because the work was done, the truth was documented, and the right people finally knew what had been buried for far too long. Some battles were won in 4 seconds. This one had taken 4 months. Both of them were necessary, and both of them were hers.